We have to find somebody that'll work with us that has dealt in the dirtiest of dirty business. We're losing.
There's one scene Netflix recorded then quietly removed. And what's scary is it connects directly to what 50 Cent hinted at years ago, but never explained. Tonight, I'll tell you why this scene matters and why it was too dangerous to air. What makes this moment unsettling isn't just that a scene was cut, it's when it was cut. Not early, not during planning, but late, after filming, after interviews, after reactions were already captured. That's the kind of removal that doesn't happen unless something unexpected surfaces. Something that changes how a story feels once you see it.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage.
People assume Netflix documentaries are tightly controlled from the start. They are, but they're also flexible until they're not. When a project reaches the final stages, almost everything left is considered safe. So when something disappears at that stage, it means someone decided the risk suddenly outweighed the benefit. And this is where Diddy's name becomes impossible to separate from the decision. Because The Reckoning wasn't just another music documentary. It was positioned as a cultural reevaluation. A moment where past behavior, influence, and power structures were meant to be looked at differently. That already puts pressure on anyone mentioned, especially someone like Diddy, whose legacy is built not just on success, but on control. Now layer 50 Cent into that. For years, 50 Cent has existed on the edge of the Diddy conversation. Not fully inside it, not fully outside it. He never makes direct claims, but he also never defends. He hints, he pauses. He laughs at moments where most people would clarify. And those moments weren't random, they were timed. When 50 Cent says less than expected, people listen harder. That's why this missing Netflix scene feels heavier now than it would have years ago. Because audiences are more aware. They remember what 50 Cent said, and more importantly, what he didn't say. And when a major platform like Netflix removes something tied to Diddy, it doesn't erase curiosity, it multiplies it. Think about how many times you've seen a controversy fade because it was overexposed. This is the opposite. This is subtraction creating pressure, silence doing work. And before we go deeper, I want to pause right here because this is where the conversation really splits. Do you think Netflix cut this scene to protect their platform or to avoid validating something 50 Cent has been hinting at for years about Diddy? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you follow everything surrounding Diddy, 50 Cent, and the stories mainstream media dances around, make sure you're subscribed because this channel covers what others won't connect. What's important to understand next is how platforms react when implication replaces accusation. Accusations can be denied. Implications can't. If the cut scene framed Diddy within a broader pattern, even subtly, that alone could shift public interpretation. Netflix doesn't need to accuse anyone to be held responsible for the conclusions viewers draw. And viewers are good at drawing conclusions. People close to documentary production often say the most dangerous moments aren't explosive statements. They're calm reflections. A pause, a look, a reaction shot that lingers half a second too long. Those moments don't tell viewers what to think. They invite them to think. If the removed scene contained reactions to Diddy that aligned too closely with things 50 Cent has alluded to in the past, then Netflix wasn't just airing content, they were accidentally giving context to a narrative they couldn't control. That's when lawyers step in. That's when edits happen quietly. 50 Cent understands this better than most. He survived by letting others speak first, then letting time reframe their words. He never rushes to be right, he waits to be proven relevant. And now with Diddy under renewed scrutiny, those old comments feel less like jokes and more like placeholders. Placeholders waiting for the right moment. What's fascinating is that 50 Cent still hasn't explained anything. Not now. Not when interest is highest. Not when speculation is loudest. That silence isn't avoidance, it's consistency. He knows explanation limits interpretation, and interpretation is where power lives. Netflix removing a scene only strengthens that dynamic, because now the audience is doing the connecting. And once audiences connect dots themselves, no platform can fully undo it. As The Reckoning circulates, people don't just watch what's there, they sense what's missing. They feel the gaps. And gaps invite theories. Theories invite revisits, rewatches, clip comparisons, Old interviews resurfacing, especially 50 Cent's. And every resurfaced clip reframes Diddy again, not through new accusations, but through accumulated unease. That's how narratives shift in the modern media cycle. Quietly, without announcements, without confirmations, just pressure. Pressure Netflix didn't want to absorb. Pressure 50 Cent never needed to explain. Pressure Diddy now can't fully escape. By the time viewers reach the end of the reckoning, the missing scene has already done its work, because absence creates more conversation than presence ever could. And this is where things move from curiosity into consequence. Because once people believe something was removed for a reason, they stop asking if there's more and start asking how much. And when those questions circle the same names, Diddy and 50 Cent over and over again, silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling strategic. And strategy always reveals itself eventually. What happens next doesn't depend on Netflix releasing anything. It doesn't depend on 50 Cent explaining himself, and it doesn't even depend on Diddy responding. It depends on how long unanswered questions are allowed to sit. Because unanswered questions don't fade, they grow. What makes this situation even more complicated is how carefully everyone involved has been moving since The Reckoning aired. Not just Netflix, but the people around the story. You don't see rushed responses. You don't see emotional denials. You see distance. And distance is rarely accidental. When documentaries cut scenes, the explanation is usually simple: time, pacing, clarity. But when no explanation is offered at all, especially for a project as scrutinized as The Reckoning, it creates a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty for long. They get filled with interpretation. This is where Diddy's silence becomes part of the narrative rather than a response to it. Silence can mean many things, but in high-profile cases, it often signals calculation. Every word spoken adds risk. Every clarification invites follow-up. And for someone whose legacy spans decades, sometimes the safest move is to let the moment pass without feeding it. But moments like this don't pass quietly. They linger because people remember patterns. And patterns are what 50 Cent has always pointed toward without ever outlining. He's never framed Diddy as a single moment or a single story. Instead, he's consistently spoken in generalities about the industry, about power, about how things used to be. Those comments age differently when revisited years later. What's striking is how often 50 Cent's comments resurface whenever Diddy's name trends. Not because 50 Cent pushes them back into the spotlight, but because the audience does. The internet has become an archive of unfinished sentences, and unfinished sentences invite completion. That's why the missing Netflix scene feels like more than an editing decision. It feels like a withheld context, something that, once seen, might have reframed how viewers interpret everything else, not by accusing Diddy of anything specific, but by altering the emotional understanding of his presence within the story. Emotion is powerful. It doesn't need facts to persuade, it needs alignment. If the removed scene aligned too closely with the tone of 50 Cent's long-standing hints, Netflix may have realized they were unintentionally validating a narrative they weren't prepared to defend. Platforms don't like being predictable, but they dislike being cornered even more. Imagine watching The Reckoning and feeling a subtle shift during a particular segment, a sense that the story was about to pivot somewhere unexpected. Then imagine that pivot disappearing entirely. You might not consciously notice what's gone, but subconsciously, something feels incomplete. Incompleteness keeps people thinking. That's why viewers don't just move on after finishing the documentary. They search, they rewatch, they compare interviews, they revisit old clips of 50 Cent talking about Diddy, now hearing them through a different lens. And every time they do, the silence around the cut scene grows louder. What's interesting is that 50 Cent has never attempted to capitalize directly on these moments. He doesn't release exposés. He doesn't do tell-all interviews. He doesn't clarify. That restraint has built credibility over time. When someone speaks rarely but consistently, their words gain weight. Diddy, on the other hand, has built a public persona rooted in presence and influence. So when that presence recedes, people notice. Not because absence proves anything, but because it contrasts with expectation. And contrast draws attention. The missing scene sits at the intersection of those two dynamics. 50 Cent's strategic silence, and Diddy's controlled distance. Netflix, positioned between them, chose removal over risk. That choice alone doesn't confirm anything, but it confirms caution. And caution usually follows surprise, something that wasn't anticipated during planning, but became impossible to ignore once it was seen in context. People who work in production often say that the most difficult decisions are made late, when momentum is already built. Removing a scene at that stage means undoing work, disrupting flow, and risking questions. Netflix accepted those consequences anyway, which suggests they believe the alternative was worse. As time passes, the absence of explanation becomes part of the documentary's legacy. Viewers don't remember every detail of what aired, but they remember the feeling that something was missing. That feeling attaches itself to the names most closely associated with the tension Diddy and 50 Cent. And once that association forms, it doesn't require reinforcement. It sustains itself. Every new interview with 50 Cent where he dodges clarity reinforces the idea that there's more beneath the surface. Every public appearance by Diddy that avoids direct engagement reinforces the sense of unresolved tension. This is how narratives evolve without official updates. They evolve through repetition, silence, and selective memory. Netflix may never address the cutscene. 50 Cent may never explain his comments. Diddy may never respond directly. But the conversation doesn't need them to continue. Because at this point, the audience has taken ownership of the story. They're not waiting for answers, they're watching behavior. Timing, what's said, what's not said, and how often the same names reappear in discussions about power, influence, and the past. And once a story reaches that stage, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to perception, and perception doesn't require confirmation to persist. By the time conversations reach this stage, something important has already shifted. The focus is no longer on what was said or shown, it's on what wasn't. And that's where stories become harder to control than headlines. Netflix understands attention cycles better than almost anyone. They know outrage burns fast, but mystery lingers. Cutting a scene doesn't erase it. It turns it into a question mark. And question marks keep people watching, rewatching, and talking. What they may not have fully anticipated is how closely that absence would align with the long shadow cast by 50 Cent's unresolved commentary about Diddy. Because unresolved commentary doesn't expire, it waits. Every time a viewer notices the edit feels abrupt, every time someone senses a tonal gap, the mind looks for context, and context sends people backward to old interviews, old clips, old remarks. That's where 50 Cent lives in this story. Not in the present, but in the archive. When people revisit those moments now, they don't hear them as jokes anymore. They hear them as signals. Carefully placed, intentionally vague, designed to survive scrutiny precisely because they never crossed a line. That's a skill 50 Cent has mastered, saying just enough to be remembered, never enough to be challenged. Diddy's role in this dynamic is different, but equally important. His public image has always relied on certainty, certainty of influence, certainty of respect, certainty of control. When that certainty softens, even slightly, it creates cognitive dissonance. People don't immediately accuse, they reassess. Reassessment is powerful because it feels personal. It feels earned. Netflix removing a scene accelerates that process. It introduces doubt without instruction. It invites interpretation without direction. And once viewers start interpreting, they don't need new material. They recycle what already exists. That's why this moment feels bigger than one documentary. It feels like a convergence. A platform stepping back, an artist staying silent, another artist who never fully spoke in the first place. Together they form a triangle of ambiguity that keeps regenerating interest. What's telling is that none of the parties involved have tried to correct the narrative. No firm denials about the cut, no clarifications about intent, no effort to shut down speculation outright. In media strategy, that's rarely accidental. Silence can be risk management, but it can also be recognition that engagement would only deepen the story. And sometimes the safest move is to let the audience exhaust itself. But this audience hasn't. Because stories tied to legacy don't exhaust easily. They echo. They resurface when conditions change. And conditions around Diddy have undeniably changed. Increased scrutiny, renewed conversations, cultural shifts in how power is viewed, all of it reframes the past without rewriting it. That's where 50 Cent's approach feels almost prophetic. By never explaining, he avoided being pinned to a specific claim. By staying vague, he allowed his words to evolve alongside public perception. It's a rare position, one that only works if time is on your side. Netflix, intentionally or not, added weight to that position by removing something they believed was safer unseen. The irony is that unseen things often become the most discussed. People now debate what the scene might have shown. Was it a reaction, a statement, a contextual moment that shifted tone? The truth almost doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that the idea of its existence has altered how the rest of the documentary is consumed. That alteration extends beyond Netflix. It spills into how people interpret Diddy's appearances, his statements, his absences. It spills into how 50 Cent's old words are replayed, clipped, and shared with captions that ask questions instead of making claims. Questions are harder to dismiss than accusations. And that's why this story continues without new information. Because it's no longer about discovery, it's about interpretation. Netflix may never release the scene. 50 Cent may never explain himself. Diddy may never address the speculation directly. But none of that stops the narrative from moving forward. In fact, it may ensure that it does. In the modern media landscape, control isn't about what you say, it's about what you allow to be said without response. Statements can be challenged, denials can be questioned, but silence? Silence creates space. And right now, that space is growing louder than any press release ever could. When no one rushes to explain, clarify, or shut things down, it signals something important. It suggests calculation, it suggests awareness, and sometimes it suggests that responding would only make things worse. That's why the absence of response from all sides, Netflix, Diddy, and even 50 Cent, feels heavier than any single comment could. This story doesn't end with a reveal. It doesn't end with a leaked clip or a sudden explanation. It ends with a shift, the kind that happens quietly, without announcement, but permanently. A shift in how people remember past moments. A shift in how old interviews are replayed and reinterpreted. A shift in how footage that once felt harmless suddenly feels loaded with meaning. A shift in how silence itself is understood. Because silence isn't empty, it's filled with implication. And once audiences begin to read implication into absence, there's no easy way to reverse that process. You can release statements, you can deny intent, but you can't force people to unsee the gaps once they've noticed them. That's what makes stories like this so powerful. They don't rely on answers, they survive on questions. Questions that don't demand resolution, only attention. Questions that resurface every time the names involved appear again. Every time an old clip is reposted. Every time someone pauses and wonders why something was removed instead of explained. Once that kind of curiosity takes hold, there's no clear reset button. The narrative stops belonging to the people at the center of it and starts belonging to perception itself. And perception doesn't need proof to persist. It only needs consistency. The most enduring stories aren't the ones that end cleanly. They're the ones that leave space. Space for interpretation, space for doubt, space for memory to change shape over time. And those gaps, the missing scenes, the unanswered comments, the silence where explanation should be, those gaps are where stories live the longest. If you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we connect the dots others leave scattered, make sure you're subscribed. And tell me in the comments, do you think this silence is a calculated strategy or the beginning of something no one can fully control anymore?